species that never got the chance to leave its own name behind. On the morning of February 12, 2020, a short paper landed in the journal Science Advances that had nothing to do with kings, sacred cities, or ancient legends. It was written by two researchers at UCLA, a computer scientist named Sriram Sankararaman, and a graduate student named Arun Durvasula. And on paper it looked like a dry, statistical exercise about genome sequences. Within hours it was being covered by the BBC, the New York Times, CNN, Newsweek, and Reuters, because buried inside ordinary genetic data from West Africa was something that should not have been there at all. Segments of DNA, sometimes making up close to a fifth of a person's entire genome, did not match any known human population. They did not match Neanderthals. They did not match Denisovans. They matched nothing on record because they came from a species science has never identified, named, or found a single bone of. And the population carrying the largest share of this unexplained genetic material was the Yoruba people of southwestern Nigeria, a population that had already spent 5 centuries at the center of one of the most stubborn origin disputes in African history. For hundreds of years, nobody could agree on where the Yoruba nation actually came from. Now geneticists were staring at evidence suggesting their ancestors had, tens of thousands of years ago, encountered and interbred with something that still has no name. To understand why that discovery landed with such force, you first have to understand the argument it walked into, an argument that had already been raging for 500 years with no end in sight. At the center of that argument sits one city, Ile-Ife, in what is now Osun State in southwestern Nigeria. Yoruba tradition calls it the birthplace of humanity, the ground from which the entire world was made. And at the center of Ile-Ife's founding story sits one figure, Oduduwa, whose true origin has never been agreed upon by the Yoruba people themselves, let alone by outsiders who spent centuries trying to explain it from the outside looking in. Ask 10 Yoruba historians where Oduduwa came from, and you will not get one answer. You will get 3, and each one carries the fingerprints of the era and the interests of whoever was telling it. The first version is entirely sacred. According to this account, Oduduwa was lowered from the heavens by Olodumare, the supreme creator, descending on a chain with only a handful of soil, a 5-toed chicken, and a palm kernel in his possession. As he descended toward the primordial waters that covered the earth, the chicken slipped free and began to fall. Reaching for it, Oduduwa let go of the soil, and both landed together on the water below. The chicken scattered the soil across the surface, and wherever it touched, dry land rose up, forming the ground on which Ile-Ife would stand. The palm kernel took root nearby and grew into a tree bearing 16 fronds, said to represent the 16 original Yoruba kingdoms descended from Oduduwa's line. In this telling, the Yoruba are not migrants at all. They are the origin point from which everyone else descended. And Ile-Ife is not just their birthplace, but the birthplace of the human race. The second version is far more earthbound, and it comes from one of the most important documents in Yoruba historiography, a manuscript written by Samuel Johnson, a Yoruba Anglican minister who spent decades in the late 19th century traveling across Yoruba territory collecting oral testimony. Johnson never saw his work published. He died in 1901, and it was his brother who finally brought the manuscript into print in 1921 under the title The History of the Yorubas. More than a century later, it remains one of the single most cited sources on Yoruba history in existence, still assigned in universities, and referenced by Yoruba historians who otherwise disagree on almost everything else about their own past. In it, Johnson recorded a version of the founding story in which Oduduwa was not a god at all but a real human migrant, a man who left Mecca after a religious dispute, traveled for 90 days, and arrived at Ile-Ife carrying idols that had made him unwelcome in his homeland. In this account, the founder of the Yoruba nation is an outsider from the Arabian Peninsula who established dominance over people who were already living there. The third version points somewhere else entirely, not Arabia but the Nile Valley, ancient Egypt, or the kingdom of Meroe in present-day Sudan. Some 19th and early 20th century writers, both European ethnographers and a handful of Yoruba historians influenced by them, propose that Oduduwa and his followers migrated west out of the Nile Valley, bringing with them the political organization and artistic sophistication that would later flower at Ile-Ife and at the neighboring kingdom of Oyo. This theory fit neatly inside a wider colonial-era framework known as the Hamitic hypothesis, the assumption, since thoroughly discredited, that any sufficiently advanced civilization south of the Sahara must have been founded or shaped by lighter-skinned outsiders from North Africa or the Near East, because indigenous sub-Saharan Africans were presumed incapable of building that level of complexity on their own. That assumption did real damage. It shaped how European scholars interpreted everything they found at Ife for decades before anyone thought to test it against hard evidence. And there was plenty for them to argue over, because what turned up at Ile-Ife was extraordinary. In 1910, a German ethnographer named Leo Frobenius arrived at the city and was shown a series of brass and terracotta heads kept in shrines, including one linked to the sea deity Olokun. Frobenius was so struck by the naturalism of the faces, the fine detail of the eyes, the scarification patterns, the sense of individual likeness in each casting, that he refused to believe African hands had made them. He proposed instead that they were remnants of the lost civilization of Atlantis. The theory sounds absurd today, but it dominated European discussion of Ife art for decades, repeated in lecture halls and popular writing as though it were a serious scholarly possibility rather than the product of a European visitor who could not accept what he was looking at. It took until 1938, when a construction crew digging near a palace compound uncovered 18 additional copper alloy heads, and until further decades of study after that, for the field to fully accept what should have been obvious from the start, that these were the work of Yoruba artisans, using a lost wax casting technique developed and refined locally. By 1948, that acceptance was mainstream among archaeologists. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found alongside the castings, along with thermoluminescence testing on the fired clay cores used inside some of the metal heads, eventually placed the production of these works between the 11th and 15th centuries, with a peak of activity somewhere around 1200 to 1450 CE, a period now referred to as Ife's Classical Age. A Nigerian postage stamp issued in 1953, 7 years before independence, even carried the image of one of these heads, a small but pointed symbol that the world had finally stopped attributing Ife's genius to anyone but the people who actually lived there. There is an older layer to this story too, one that predates Ife itself by well over 1,000 years. Long before the classical age of Ife bronzes, the same general region of Nigeria was home to the Nok culture, known today almost entirely through its terracotta figures, some of the earliest sculptural art produced anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, dated roughly between 500 BCE and 200 CE. Ife metalworking arose more than a millennium after Nok terracotta production had already ended, and while archaeologists are cautious about drawing a straight, unbroken line between the two traditions, the sequence itself undercuts the old colonial assumption that sophisticated art only ever arrived in West Africa from somewhere else. The region had already produced sculptural traditions of its own centuries before Oduduwa, Mecca, or Egypt ever entered the conversation. Linguistic research pushed the story back even further than the bronzes could reach. Studies of the Yoruba language's internal structure suggest it had already been developing in place for well over 2,000 years, emerging gradually out of earlier populations settled in the forest zone of what is now southwestern Nigeria, with the settlement at Ife itself beginning to take shape as early as the 5th century BCE. None of this supported a single dramatic founding migration from Mecca or the Nile. It suggested something slower, older and far less tidy, a civilization that grew up largely where it stood, absorbing outside contact without being created by it. But archaeology and linguistics could only carry the debate so far. Neither discipline could answer the most basic biological question sitting underneath all three legends. Where did the actual ancestors of the Yoruba people come from, genetically speaking? Were they, as the Mecca and Egypt traditions implied, the descendants of a relatively recent population that arrived from somewhere far away and settled on top of an existing group? Or did their ancestry run deep and continuous, rooted in West Africa for thousands of years without any major outside admixture at all? For that question, only DNA could give a real answer, and DNA did not become available to ask that question with any precision until surprisingly recently. For most of the 20th century, African populations were badly underrepresented in genetic research, even though Africa holds more human genetic diversity than every other continent on Earth combined. That began to change in 2008, when the International HapMap project, followed soon after by the 1000 Genomes project, set out to build a comprehensive catalog of human genetic variation using reference populations drawn from every major region of the globe. From West Africa, researchers selected a single group to represent the region, the Yoruba people of Ibadan, Nigeria, now known in genetics literature by the shorthand YRI. That sample went on to become one of the most heavily used African datasets in the history of human genomics. The 1000 Genomes project eventually sequenced more than 2,500 individuals across 26 populations on 5 continents, cataloging upward of 84 million genetic variants, and every time a researcher anywhere in the world needed a West African reference point to compare against European, East Asian, or South Asian samples, there was a strong chance they reached for Yoruba data. It meant that once the origin question was finally put to genomics, instead of oral tradition, the raw material to answer it was already sitting in laboratories on multiple continents. The first real clue came from mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down almost unchanged from mother to child across generations, accumulating mutations slowly enough to trace deep ancestry. A forensic genetic study analyzing the mitochondrial control region in 71 Yoruba individuals identified 65 distinct mitochondrial haplotypes, producing a haplotype diversity score of 9976, a figure so close to the theoretical maximum that it placed Yoruba maternal lineages among the most diverse ever recorded for any human population. That level of diversity is consistent with a basic fact about human genetics. Because modern humans originated in Africa, African populations have had far longer than anyone else on the planet to accumulate genetic variation. And West Africa in particular carries some of the richest diversity anywhere, often more variation within a single Nigerian region than exists across entire continents outside Africa, a fact that by itself quietly reframes how the people tend to think about ethnic identity within Nigeria and across West Africa more broadly. Diversity on its own did not settle the origin question. What mattered was how that diversity compared to neighboring populations. Geneticists use a measure called FST to score how genetically separated two groups are from one another, with a value near zero, meaning the groups are barely distinguishable, and a high value pointing to a long history of separation. When researchers compared the Yoruba sample against a broader Nigerian dataset from the Thousand Genomes Project, the FST value came out effectively at zero, a statistically meaningless difference. Compared against a geographically close population in Ghana, the distance was also tiny and not statistically significant. On the maternal line, in other words, Yoruba ancestry blends almost seamlessly into the surrounding West African genetic landscape. There is no sign of a separate maternal lineage suddenly appearing from Arabia or the Nile Valley. Genetically speaking, the mothers of the Yoruba nation look like the mothers of West Africa as a whole. A second study widened the lens further, comparing 5 major Nigerian ethnic groups: Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Tiv, and Ibibio, using 9 short tandem repeat markers, the same class of markers used today in forensic identification and paternity testing. Researchers drew blood samples from 250 consenting participants across their respective ethnic homelands and compared allele patterns at all 9 locations. Yoruba and Igbo showed a similarity score of 0, 993, the highest pairing in the entire study. Yoruba and Ibibio came in at 0, 990, Yoruba and Hausa at 0, 992, Yoruba and Tiv at 0, 987. By contrast, Igbo and Ibibio, despite being close geographic neighbors, scored the lowest similarity of any pairing in the study at 0, 895, a reminder that geography does not always predict genetic closeness the way most people casually assume it should. When the researchers ran a full analysis of molecular variants across all 5 groups, the results were even more striking. Nearly 98% of all genetic variation existed between individuals regardless of ethnicity, while only about 10% could be attributed to differences between entire ethnic populations. Put simply, 2 random Yoruba people are likely to show more genetic difference from each other than the average Yoruba person shows, compared with the average Hausa, Igbo, or Tiv person. Ethnicity in Nigeria is a powerful cultural and linguistic category built on language, tradition, and political history, but at the level of the genome, these populations sit far closer together than distinct. That finding quietly undercut both the Mecca and the Egypt origin theories, since both require Yoruba ancestry to be meaningfully separate from surrounding West African populations because of a relatively recent, geographically distant founding migration. What the genome showed instead was the opposite: deep and continuous overlap with neighboring peoples, rather than a layer of foreign ancestry sitting on top of a separate population. A third line of research went further still and produced a twist nobody had anticipated. Researchers examining both maternal mitochondrial DNA and paternal Y chromosome markers across Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo populations, a combined sample of 358 individuals, found that all 3 groups shared a broadly similar maternal genetic substrate, consistent with a long-standing cultural pattern in which women historically married into their husband's community, while men tended to remain in their birthplace. The paternal picture told a different story. Yoruba and Igbo, both speakers of languages from the Niger-Congo family, showed paternal lineages correlated with other Niger-Congo-speaking populations, regardless of geography. Hausa, whose language belongs to the entirely separate Afroasiatic family, showed paternal lineages aligned instead with other Afroasiatic-speaking populations scattered across the continent, along with a noticeably higher diversity of paternal lineages drawn from a much wider geographic range. On the paternal line, in West Africa, ancient language and ancient ancestry appear to move together in ways that cut across simple geography. That result did not hand a win to the Mecca or Egypt theories either. Arabic and ancient Egyptian both belong to the Afro-Asiatic family, and if Yoruba paternal ancestry carried significant roots in either place, it would likely show some pull toward that same cluster the way Hausa ancestry does. It does not. Yoruba paternal lineages sit firmly inside the Niger-Congo cluster, reinforcing the same conclusion that maternal evidence had already pointed to: deep, local West African roots, rather than a recent arrival from Arabia or the Nile. By that point, genetics had done something 500 years of oral tradition, colonial theorizing, and archaeological argument had never managed. It did not simply crown one legend the winner over the other two. It moved past all three, replacing origin stories built around founder figures and long-distance migration with a picture of continuous, in-place development stretching back thousands of years, deeply woven into the wider fabric of West African peoples. By most measures, that should have closed the book on the Yoruba origin question for good. It didn't. Because in February 2020, the same kind of genomic tools that had just settled a 500-year historical argument turned up something that had nothing to do with Ile-Ife, Oduduwa, or any of the last 2,000 years of recorded or oral history at all. Here's the background most people outside genetics do not know. People with European, Asian, or Oceanian ancestry today typically carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA in their genomes, leftover genetic material from interbreeding events that took place tens of thousands of years ago as modern humans migrated out of Africa and encountered these other archaic human relatives. For a long time, the working assumption was that West African populations, whose ancestors never left the continent, carried none of this kind of archaic DNA at all, since Neanderthals and Denisovans lived and died in Europe and Asia, not Africa. Sankararaman and Durvasula set out to test that assumption directly, building a statistical method that did not need a reference genome from the archaic population in question, because no such reference genome existed. Using publicly available genomic data from the 1000 Genomes Project, they analyzed 4 West African populations: Yoruba, Isan, Mende, and Gambian. What they found was something no oral tradition, no archaeological excavation, and no historical manuscript could ever have anticipated. Buried inside the genomes of Yoruba and Mende individuals in particular were segments of DNA, in some individuals amounting to between 2 and 19% of the entire genome, that matched neither modern human ancestry, nor Neanderthal, nor Denisovan ancestry. The material appeared to come from what researchers call a ghost population, an extinct, unnamed branch of the human family tree that split away from the ancestors of modern humans, before the evolutionary divergence that eventually produced Neanderthals and Denisovans. No fossil of this population has ever been recovered anywhere on Earth. No species name exists for it in the scientific literature. Its only trace is a mathematical signature buried inside modern DNA, and Sankararaman himself, when the paper broke, told reporters that his team simply did not have a clear identity for the group, which was exactly why they called it a ghost. At some point, tens of thousands of years ago, somewhere within the African continent, the ancestors of today's Yoruba and Mende people encountered and interbred with a now extinct human relative that science cannot yet name, in an event that left behind no bones, no tools, no burial site, nothing except its genetic echo. Some of that inherited material does not look random at all. The researchers found that certain archaic segments were retained in modern populations at higher frequencies than chance would predict, clustering near genes involved in functions like tumor suppression and hormone regulation, a pattern consistent with these ancient genetic contributions having offered some kind of survival advantage that helped them spread rather than fade out over tens of thousands of years. The same analysis picked up the faint traces of this same unexplained ancestry in Han Chinese and European populations too, though at far lower levels than in the Yoruba and Mende samples, suggesting that whatever this archaic population actually was, its genetic footprint may extend across a wider stretch of humanity than researchers initially expected. The story broke everywhere almost immediately, spreading far beyond the usual audience of academic genetics journals and into ordinary news feeds within a single day. Within days, the finding had been picked up by the BBC, the New York Times, CNN, The Guardian, Reuters, Newsweek, NPR, National Geographic's News Division, and Science News, among others, each outlet reaching for some version of the same phrase, a ghost hiding in the human genome. It is worth being precise about what this discovery does and does not claim. The ghost population identified in that 2020 paper is a statistical inference drawn from patterns in modern genomes, not a confirmed species represented by a fossil sitting in a museum case somewhere. Researchers in the years since have debated the exact percentages, the precise timing of the interbreeding event or events, and whether the pattern in the data reflects one single ghost population or several smaller, distinct introgression events layered on top of each other. That kind of scientific disagreement is normal, and it is ongoing. But the core finding that West African genomes, Yoruba genomes very much included, carry measurable ancestry from an archaic human lineage entirely outside the known Neanderthal and Denisovan family tree, has held up across multiple independent analyses since the original publication, and it has pushed other research groups to search for similar signals in populations elsewhere on the continent. Think about what that means for the tens of millions of people who identify as Yoruba today, and for the much larger number, Some estimates put the figure above 100 million who carry some connection to Yoruba culture or spiritual tradition worldwide. Beginning in the 16th century and accelerating over the following 300 years, the transatlantic slave trade forcibly carried enormous numbers of Yoruba people across the ocean to Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, Trinidad, and beyond. Their descendants never stopped carrying the culture with them, even when the language, the names, and the outward form had to change to survive. In Brazil, Yoruba spiritual practice reshaped itself into candomblé. In Cuba, it became the foundation of Santeria. Across large parts of the Caribbean, the veneration of Yoruba deities, such as Shango, Yemoja, and Oshun, continued for centuries under new names and new circumstances, carried forward by people who had been forcibly separated from their homeland, but never fully cut off from it. Every one of those descendants, whether they know it or not, may be carrying forward fragments of that same unidentified genetic inheritance, tens of thousands of years old, folded into a story that already stretches from Ila Ife to Ibadan to Bahia to Havana. The same population that geneticists chose as a global reference point for human diversity, the same population whose maternal, paternal, and short tandem repeat markers finally settled a 500-year historical dispute. Turns out to be one of the clearest windows science currently has into a chapter of a human evolution nobody was even looking for when they went looking for Oduduwa. So the 500-year argument over where the Yoruba nation came from did eventually get answered, and the answer turned out to be simpler than any of the three competing legends and far stranger than any of them ever imagined. The ancestors of the Yoruba people were not recent arrivals from Mecca, and they were not migrants down the Nile from ancient Egypt. Their roots run deep and continuous within West Africa itself, intertwined for thousands of years with the neighboring peoples around them, exactly as the maternal, paternal, and short tandem repeat evidence all independently suggested. But layered underneath that long local history sits something none of the old legends, none of the colonial theorists, and none of the 20th century historians could have ever guessed at: a trace of contact with another kind of human being entirely. A lineage that vanished from the fossil record so completely that it left no bones behind anywhere on Earth, and yet survived, quietly, inside the DNA of people who are alive right now. If a question this old about a single nation's origin could still be hiding a secret this deep, this strange, and this well-preserved, it raises an obvious question about everywhere else on the map that genetics has not yet had the chance to look this closely. For 500 years, the only tools available to answer where the Yoruba came from were memory, faith, and the assumptions of whoever happened to be holding the pen. Genetics did not just add one more version to the pile of legends. It replaced the entire premise of the argument, showing that origin and identity do not have to come from a founding figure crossing a desert or a river, that a people can simply belong to the ground they have always stood on, generation after generation, while still carrying inside them a piece of a much older and far stranger story written by a species that never got the chance to leave its own name behind. On the morning of February 12, 2020, a short paper landed in the journal Science Advances that had nothing to do with kings, sacred cities, or ancient legends. It was written by two